The festive season is almost here, and so today we're going to be reviewing and painting Games Workshop's Special Edition Miniature, the Red Gobbo and Bounca. If you're curious about how I paint this model, please stick around. First off, my apologies, there has been a bit of a break on this channel recently. We had a bit of a heat wave here in Australia and my painting area with no air conditioning has become insufferable. I've now relocated my painting area, so I apologise if there's some weird camera angles. I'm working on cleaning that up in this setup and doing more regular videos in the new year. Anyways, here's the Red Gobbo and Bounca. This model is just a single sprue, and to my surprise there's no separate base plate. Instead, the base is part of the sprue. Normally I'm not a fan of this because I like to be able to build up the base of special characters with extra details, but I do appreciate how good the sculpted detail is on the base already. As I built the model, I considered doing the two characters as sub-assemblies, but decided against it. Instead, the only piece I'm leaving off is the string of lights that's being dragged by Bounca, as they are likely to get in the way and can be easily added later. This model is fairly easy to build. You will need glue as it is not push fit. The only extra optional piece is the nose, which I've decided to include even though the box art shows Bounca without the red nose. This also helps set some of my colour choices. I didn't like the idea of having a red nose on a red body, so instead I'm going to paint Bounca green. I will leave a full list of the paints in the description, along with some notes if you would like to copy my scheme. I'm starting with a base coat of black using a Vallejo surface primer. I'm using an airbrush, but you can achieve similar results with a spray can or simply using a brush. Make sure you thin your paints with water or airbrush thinner so the model doesn't lose any of this fantastic detail. Next I'm using white acrylic ink to do a Xenopho Highlight. To do this, simply spray downwards on a 30-degree angle to brighten areas of the model that would naturally be brightened by the sun. I like to use acrylic ink because of how fine the pigments are, leaving very little speckling, but thinned white paint will also work fine. If you do use ink, then make sure you give it some time to dry, and then coat the model in a layer of satin varnish. If you do not use varnish, then washes may cause the ink to run into the recesses, which will ruin your paint job. Once the varnish is dry, I use some white paint to highlight areas that I don't feel are bright enough. I like to have a pretty good feel for the values of the light before I start to add colour to the model, especially when the model is this complex with this many points of interest and fascinating details. I'm going to be using a few contrast paints on this model, so having the light values worked out pretty early will help a lot in achieving a cohesive and interesting look. As mentioned, since Bounca will have a red nose, I want him to have a green body. I also don't want him to look the same as the Red Gobbo. To start, I'm going to lay down a very light coat of Vallejo Game Air Dead Flesh. This will help form a strong base for the contrast paint, which will be Plaguebearer's flesh. Now, rather than list every paint that I'm going to be using while painting this model, I'm going to list them in the description so it is easy to copy the list and follow along. You definitely don't have to use the exact same colours to get a fantastic result, but the contrast paints especially are worth having in your arsenal. If you haven't used contrast paints before, they perform more like a watered down ink, where the colours coat the model and the recess areas are a lot darker, helping to form a smooth transition between light and dark areas on the model. Contrast paints can be very helpful if you are still developing your brush technique and have not yet comfortable building up layers of colour. However, professional painters also use them a fair bit, so it's not just something for beginners. You can also mix and blend the contrast paints a little bit to make smooth transitions. For example, as I do Bounca's gums in pink, I'm not afraid to overlap a bit with the green, as it makes the face look a lot more natural than having hard lines between the pink and green areas. One thing to note with contrast paints is you need to keep an eye on how much it is pooling. If it is pooling too much, then use a dry brush to remove some of the paint. You want to do this as soon as you notice the pooling, otherwise you might have some inconsistencies. There is a lot of details on this model, so it is easy to get lost in which bits to paint next. I normally like to start with the areas of the model that are hardest to reach, and the areas that have the largest surface area on the model. The reason for this is fairly simple. You can avoid mistakes and brushing areas you didn't mean to by targeting tricky spots first. By also targeting large areas, you can get a good feel for the overall colour and light balance of the model fairly early, and fixing anything that doesn't feel quite right before it becomes too difficult. Once all the large areas are blocked in with base colour or contrast, it's time to think more about what the material is that you're trying to paint. For areas of the skin and hair, the model does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, as the natural textures and muscle definitions really help to make it look organic. Fabric can be a little bit harder, as you need to think about how the fabric responds to light and plan your highlights accordingly. For metallics, it really depends on how you want to approach it. If you would like low difficulty but highly effective metallics, then using a metallic paint with shade and highlights is once again essential. I haven't been using a lot of shade on this model, but on all the metallics I'm going to be using Nuln oil as the shade, and dry brushing with a really bright silver to make sure that it catches all the corners of the metal to really make it look sharp and detailed. If you're aiming for a much shinier metal look, then you should look into doing non-metallic metal, or NMM. I'm not using that technique on this model, but it works by understanding the reflectivity of the metal and the environment the model is in. For example, if you're outside in a field, then the light that reflects off the armor at an angle below the horizon would contain greens and browns, while reflections from above the horizon will be a lot brighter and contain blues. There are quite a few videos out there on this technique if that interests you. For the basing of this model, I was actually pretty happy with what had been sculpted. However, I really hated the obvious join between the base and the model. So I'm going to use the Vallejo ground texture and a rubber brush to cover these gaps and make it look more seamless. That's pretty much it for this model. I really enjoyed painting it. It is exactly what I needed after taking a bit of a break from painting. I'm curious to hear if you have any feedback about the format of these videos. It's interesting when I look at other painting tutorials. There is a spectrum of very detailed, these are the exact colours and the exact process and order for painting a model. Then at the other end of the spectrum, there are more established and longer running hobby channels that don't dive into the detail at all, and instead just talk about the techniques and ideas that they used. I'm sort of aiming somewhere in the middle right now. I want to provide you with enough detail that if you are new and less experienced, you can work out the exact colours that you need and the exact techniques that you need to use. But I also want to discuss the theory and not just make it too much of a drag if you're already familiar with these techniques. So let me know what you think and what models you would like to see next. I'm pretty eager to get back to my Sisters of Battle after spending a lengthy time on my Stormcast Eternals. The backlog is getting a little intimidating, so your support by subscribing and liking this video will be very much appreciated and helps me to put out content more regularly. Wishing you all the best this festive season, and hoping that with all the turmoil in the world, you manage to find some peace and family.